right. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon for some of us. Welcome to the first in a series of health webinars. My name is Maggie Grandin, and I work for AIHEC, which is the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. I'm really excited to begin this series with you. Definitely be on the lookout. We're hoping to have these health webinars happening pretty regularly, so be on the lookout for more to come throughout the summer and into the fall, and hopefully further on than that. I'm really excited to present to you our first presenter, Yakaiyastai Gorman. Yakaiyastai Gorman is from the Steamboat, Arizona area of Navajo and Cheyenne Tribes. She is a graduate of Northwest Indian College, and her current work includes Native Environmental Science Instructor, as well as Behavioral Health Program Coordinator and Interim Community Health Aide Coordinator. We are really excited to have Yakaiyastai present with us today. She is a very knowledgeable person, and I know many of the people attending today probably know her more personally, and so we're just really excited to have her present on her Indigenous holistic health. Okay, well, thank you all, and I will pass it over to Yakaiyastai.
Hello, everybody. Let me just go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. Please forget how to do a full screen on here. I guess this is okay. All right. I'm here today to talk about Indigenous holistic health. As Maggie introduced me, my name is Yakaiyastai Gorman. I currently work at the Northwest Indian College as a behavioral health program coordinator, and then working as an interim community health program coordinator. A lot of my work entails writing curriculum in an Indigenous lens, and really looking at different types of health models that we can incorporate in tribal health-based practices to ourselves, for students, and then in healthcare system for Indigenous people. And so kind of off of that, some of our objectives will really be diving in a little bit into identity, connection to self, holistic health practice, and then unlearning. And this is really kind of folding into how we utilize holistic health. So Aide, Yahdi, Yakaiyastai Nanabah Gorman-Etl, Ado no da na kaidene bushichin, Hushkado dashchate or dashanale. And as I said, I work at Northwest Indian College as a behavioral health program coordinator, currently working on a master's at Antioch University in clinical mental health counseling. And so what I really like to do is start off with that introduction to really ground us in what we would call shaping ourselves. And this goes into a holistic model of how did we create our worldview. Some of these things really come from our infancy, our adolescence, our adulthood, and then even into elderly. And in all phases of these life, they're all essential to our worldview and what creates what we have now. So a part of shaping ourselves, we look at infancy. This is where we're really observing norms, creating relationships, and that understanding of how we connect with each other. This goes by norms, values, and morals, really learning the dynamics of a family, learning the dynamics of a community. And so those morals and those values is what set the infant up to getting into adolescence, right? Kind of testing a little bit of those boundaries, learning how to use those norms and values. And so the shaping of ourself, I would say, is very, very complex, right? And given what we know about ourselves and how we function on a day-to-day basis, right? How many of you have ever heard, like, why do you do that the way you do that? Or why do you say it that way, right? So all of these things are a shaping of ourself. And all of these things are influenced by every part of these stages, whether it be from another person who might be an adult or an elderly, how you interact with adolescent children, or how you interact with infants. All of these things are essential to the way that we look at the world, the way that our health and our holistic being kind of centers us. And so when we move into adulthood, it really goes into learning and exercising these norms. And the way that I like to think about it is when I was a young girl, and I remember when I was an infant, kind of learning how to walk around, everything that I touched was new. Everything that I tasted, everything that I looked at, it was a whole new experience every single time. When you get into adolescence, it's kind of like you see the things repetitively. When you're an adult, then you kind of lose touch with those things that are repetitive. And this is where you learn to exercise and teach younger children how to, interact with these things. As you become elderly at this point, right, we should become specialized within those norms and those values and morals. And so this really sets up a shaping of ourself. So throughout this presentation, I want you to think about, what does self mean to me? Who am I, right? And so I always lead with this type of teaching. And so this is really a blessing way type of teaching. And many of you know that Navajo people really go along the lines of what we call Sa'angwebik Akwajon, which is living in a beautiful way. And when you break that word up, it really means a lot of different things, right? All of these different words that kind of play into how you're supposed to be. So when you break it up, it goes into ancestral teachings. It goes into understanding self, understanding your actions and reactions. So every part of you is present within this. And part of that blessing way teaching is that accountability for your actions and what you do, and doing things in a beautiful way. So when we look at identifying parts of ourselves, really it comes down to identity. And I think this is such a huge topic when we look at the world that we're in now, right? And one of the biggest things that I say is, within identity, when you look at your life now, how much of your identity is authentic in every single space, right? How much of yourself do you truly show? And when we look at how that plays into holistic health, how many of you have felt like there's a part of you that you have to put pieces away in order to be in that space? And so the shaping of identity, the shaping of our holistic health relies on how we know who we are. And for myself, the way that I look at this is looking ancestrally, who am I, right? And so going a little bit into my story, my grandpa was a code talker on my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, they were medicine people. And so that ancestral knowledge of what gives me purpose and what I need to learn in order to pass down. And so when we look at our lives, right, what is that inherited livelihood that we're supposed to be living by? And then does that reflect within our work? Does that reflect in how we take care of ourselves? This really goes into familial history. You know, how many of us really go down that rabbit hole of figuring out who was my parents' parents, where did they come from? And for me, I feel like this has always been forefront to who I am based on my clan systems. So Navajo people, they have a innate connection to other Navajo people through their clan system. And the way that kinship works is that it really sets up the connections that you're going to have throughout your life. And the way that it was explained to me is that it is really a governing system, an important part of kinship and the society that we live in, what we bring to the table. It really forms a family lifestyle of norms, ethics, and what's going to be passed down to our children. So I want you to take a minute, right, and just pause and think about who is your family. And I want you to picture the people that you know are your family. Do you see their faces? What are they doing? How are they connected to you? And so these types of relationships that we have that are included in our identity, this is how we're connected to our parents, our grandparents, and it teaches us how to treat ourselves, right? When you look at the ones that you love and you look at the people who are connected to you and you think about family, nobody wants to see family hurt. Nobody wants to see them in a place where they're not taking care of themselves, right? And so I want you to kind of take this in, right? Different parts of identity. There's different parts in terms of our mental state, our emotional state, our physical state, and even what I call ethos, right? Or that spiritual part of us. And when we look at our purpose, if one of those parts of us is lacking in some sense, that holistic health that goes into our identity, right? Let's say emotionally, right? We feel cut off, we feel like we're not balanced in that same way. Then there's a part of us that might hold back or be scared, or there might be a part of us that might be impulsive and do things out of fear. And so holistic health, we look at different parts of community and leadership. And the way that I like to think about leadership is that each one of us has the autonomy, our own being, to have our own thoughts. And in that same way, we govern the way that we think, what we take in, and what we put out. And so kind of going back to this, right, acknowledging that we're all spiritual beings having a human experience. And I love that because when we're going through this world, right, each one of us is within a human body. And one thing that was taught to me from my mom was, you take care of your human body because this is your transportation through your whole life, right? And so looking back at our ancestors and how they took care of themselves, we look to them for guidance. How did they eat? When did they wake up? What did they do for sustenance? What did they do when they were having ailments, mentally, emotionally, physically? And these really bring forward a lot of our legacy gifts that help guide and teach us to be our full authentic selves. That spiritual truth that really balances us in today's society. So what do I mean by that? When we look at our connection to self, we go back to when we were inside the womb, right? And I know when I was having children, one of the biggest things that was stressed was holistic health, how you take care of yourself when you're growing another human being. Because in that same moment, you're sharing a heartbeat with that human being. You're sharing every single part of your body, vessel, blood, everything. And so this kinship part is sacred. It's the part that really connects us to how we're going to develop. And in these different stages, right, we have our mental stage, which comes first, our brain, our spine. And then after that, it's our emotional state, which becomes our vagus nerve, our parasympathetic system that kind of grows within our body. And then physically, we start to take form. And I really like to think about this in terms of Navajo ways of teaching, from when we think about how Navajo people were created. There's a saying called, "We are Indigenous," meaning we are holy people with 5 fingers. And in that same way, if we are holy people, how do we treat holy people? And this really goes into the importance of how we treat ourselves, right? Do we see ourselves as a spiritual holy being? Somebody who is going through this life day by day and understanding, how do I take care of myself? What are my needs? And I think that when we look at kinship and all the things that have kind of disconnected us from being able to feel those types of needs, the society can really set us up in a way where it feels like when we want our needs met, it's very selfish, right? And so the importance of kinship is to really create that foundation. And in Indigenous societies, when we look at our connection to one another, we really look at it as a whole, right? This whole infrastructure relies on family, and then how it goes out into the community, how that affects future generations and even the world. This can also affect our connection to our our ancestors. And that Indigenous society began with that acknowledgement of life and gratefulness of life. So I want you to take a moment, take a deep breath, and breathe out. And look at your hands, look at your body, your mind. Be grateful for life, right? We woke up again today. We're doing what we need to in order to live in this world. And so that part of gratefulness within life is how we really look at that kinship. And kinship isn't necessarily just from people to people, right? Kinship, it can be with animals, the land, the things that you have, even on your desk, right? We have an emotional attachment to things. And so in that same way, being grateful for all of those things. And so retrospection for introspection is kind of what I like to call this. There have been a lot of things that happen in history. And so when we look at history, sometimes it can be painful to really see what has set us up to be where we're at today, what has disconnected us from what we call being human, right? So I like to show a couple of these pictures and really kind of take in what has happened, right? When we look at planning your family, and if you look closely, you can see before there's a lot of children, a mom and a dad, and then only one animal. And then after, right, a mom and a dad and a child, and then more livestock. So on a day-to-day basis, when we're thinking about how this world has changed and what has changed, right? In some ways, it seems we have traded a lot of different things for others. And the way that success looks like to us probably doesn't look like this, right? And for Indigenous people, children were considered sacred. Every time a child was born, it was celebrated. And I think back on my children when they were born and my parents, right? One of the teachings that they told us was children give their grandparents life. A lot of that part of them that has gone through their whole entire life, learning and unlearning, right? They get to a stage where they are back to innocence. They're back to a place where they can understand that childlike part of themselves. And so we're all on a journey to this same thing. And so that disconnection that we have, and really looking at the different things throughout history, what has set us up for where we're at now and how we see the world. And that really comes down to, what do we see as success, right? What has affected us so much that we feel like we need more, or we don't feel like we have enough, or that we are enough. And so holistic health, it's not just one part, and it's not very simple. It's very complex, especially when we start to look at how we start to heal ourselves internally, and then we start to move forward. And so I always like to think about how, when we look at those pictures and we're in this life now, sometimes it can feel like we have a lot of burden, right? Native and non-native. One, we're trying to revitalize and trying to help. On the other hand, we get stuck in our daily routines, lost in our work tasks, lost in the things that we're trying to climb the ladder of success. And a lot of it can be detrimental to our health. A lot of it can affect our holistic being. And when we're not taking care of our holistic being, we might feel it, right? How many of you throughout the day, when you come home, you just need a minute to debrief, right? You need a minute to just take a breath, take all of today off. And that's normal. And I think that when we are able to feel those things and we're able to sit with them, then we're able to move from one reality to the next, right? And really think about what is going to feed me for tomorrow, what is going to really nourish who I am, what I am. And so I really love to always say this: each one of us has a story. Each one of us has a purpose and a responsibility to creating a better future. And I think that all of you coming here today, thinking about Indigenous holistic health, that is a great step. That's a great step to learning and understanding what it is that we need to do. So when we're looking at these two realities, one of the biggest things that I think, even for myself, I get caught in, right, is that lost in our work from day-to-day tasks, and then trying to practice culture that takes a lot of time and practice and repetition. And culture is a lifetime of practice. When you're exercising it, you're exercising that mental sovereignty, you're exercising who you are and where you come from. You're also bringing forward a lot of your ancestors who have done that practice before, right? And so in that same way, when we look at ourselves as not just human, but in a science point of view, right? Each one of us are a bag of cells. And in that same way, the way that we splice genes to create another human being, they're also a piece of us. They're also a piece of that cell. And so when we're looking at these practices, how are we all connected? How does this affect all of us together? And so really kind of thinking about the holistic health, I like to break it up in 4 different places and just kind of bring you back to your core, right? In your core, you are an embodiment of your ancestor. And so when you think about how you're an embodiment, right? So that core part of you that has learned that repetition of how to take care of yourself or how not to take care of yourself, all of those things repeat. And then the same thing with the epi, right? The outer parts of ourselves. How do we physically represent our ancestors? And the ethos, that connection to our past and our present and our future. This really connects us back to our historical practices as people. And some of those philosophies that, we might not practice on a day-to-day basis, like kinship. And lastly, the future, right? Thinking about our future. When we look at our future and we look at children and how they will be the next generation that will be picking up where we left off, or they might be the ones to change the things that we didn't get a chance to change in our lifetime. And so I like to use the holistic health model, really breaking them up into these categories, because sometimes it can be a lot to just work on yourself altogether, right? So I would suggest, starting with your core, who are you? What is your identity? Where did you come from? What is your purpose? Those types of things. And kind of going into these pictures on this side, I use this picture a lot because it really impacts a lot of who I am, what I do, and the things that I learn for myself and my children, my family. This picture here was taken when I was 13 years old. And this was during a time when I was transitioning from childhood to adulthood or womanhood. And this was taken during my puberty ceremony. During this time, I noticed that holistic health model was very present. One, having that mental sovereignty. Two, understanding a lot of what I'm doing within this ceremony is not just representation of me, but it's representation of so many stories that come with my people. So looking at corn, when Diné people were created, they had white and yellow corn. They had different types of stones. There were songs and prayers, buckskin, feathers. All of these things came together to create a human being. And so when you look at yourself, right, we have blue veins, we have red veins, white eyes, black pupils, black hair, maybe. Different parts of us might have these different colors. And this really is in representation of the importance of how we were created. That holistic health model of we want this child that comes into this world to have these things. And so for me, when I look at that, right, the corn is very important to that ceremony of understanding growth, understanding our essential of needs, water, earth, heat, and air. And all of us need that, right? And so today, when you're sitting in your office or where you're at, take a minute to go outside, take a minute to ground yourself, take a minute to really take in what plants do for us. The other thing, right, looking at the basket, this really represents a lot of our understanding of how we go through life. On one hand, it might be that road that we take in representation of the mountains, in representation of how strong sometimes we have to be. And then that background of how we're woven together and how these philosophies create a lot of who we are. And I really like to bring this forward. So the picture with the women that are stirring corn together, it really reminds me of this particular moment as well, right? And this particular moment really goes into the practices of community, the practices of kinship. I remember being 13 and thinking about womanhood and how scary that transition might be. And so each one of us are always going through transitions, and each one of us are always having a little bit of fear, right? And there's always a little bit of excitement there. And so one thing that brought me back to the present moment, took me out of that fear, was sitting with my grandmas, my mom, my sisters, and singing a song all together and harmonizing with one another. And the song was about the corn. And it goes a little bit like this. Hande hangai hai, hande hangai hai, ila sheye wastelon, ila sheye wastelon, Yahweh oh hey hey wastelon, hey hey hey. Elisha, wasting on. Elisha, wasting on. Yahweh, oh, hey, hey, wasting on. Hey, hey. And so from that song, right, it really goes into that core part of you. Because that song comes from many, many years back of women who have created life and have gone through that womanhood ceremony. It was almost like in that moment, I'm connected to them. And then even in that same way, the outer part of me, right? Within the ceremony, we have to run 4 times a day and yell. And so that physical part of us, sometimes it might be hard to get up and go run. Sometimes we might be battling things that we don't want to face. And so a lot of that part of us, you know, running or singing, or it might be just sitting and feeling what we need to. That holistic part of ourselves is really being intentional and aware of us. And I think in a lot of ways that disconnect and that understanding and connection to ourselves has been lost, right? A lot of our needs have been placed in how do we help someone? How do we do more, right? And these things set us up for how our holistic health goes down. So I want you to take a minute and just kind of, I'll give like 2 minutes, you know, just to think about what is your holistic health model? What do you do to really ground yourself and understand all 4 parts of these things? Okay. So practice. When I think about practice, it really means going back to our root of identity, understanding our sense of place, and understanding who you are as a person, your worldview and how that was shaped, and then your purpose. Every now and then we need to practice our connection to self, taking a moment to be present to ourselves, understanding how we're feeling, what we're thinking, why we're thinking that, right? And it takes a lot of introspection. And sometimes it's not linear. A lot of times it can jump around everywhere, and that's okay. So the holistic health, this really means focusing on all parts of yourself. When we say holistic health is mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, that's one part of it. But the other parts of it is the in-depth things of yourself, right? What are we doing on a day-to-day basis that contradicts our holistic health? What are we doing that maybe even we betray our core? We might betray our physical being. All of these things need a little bit of practice and focus. And then the learning and unlearning. I like to think about this in a way where we're always on a learning path throughout our entire life. And this goes back to the teachings of how my dad always said, you know, we never stop learning, and that's why our brain never stops working, right? Our brain can always rewire. Our brain can always learn new information. And in that same way, we can always learn new information. We can always transform. So I just want to say thank you, AIHEC. Thank you for listening to me and going through my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was absolutely wonderful, very informative. And your song was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. We do want to open it up now to any questions you may have. If you aren't comfortable or you aren't able to take yourself off mute, you're welcome to put questions into the chat and we'll read them out. And additionally, if you have any comments that you want to share, please feel free. No structured, structured pattern going on here. So feel free to unmute yourself or put something in the chat.
I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this webinar, and I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward. I'll be watching my email and looking forward to the next part of this series. So thank you so much for the presentation, Yakaiyastai. And thank you, Maggie, for hosting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all again for joining us. We are really excited to be able to bring this all to you.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Yep, go ahead.
So this is a hard question to articulate, but when you're talking about self and you're talking about the relationship with your ancestors, like I totally understand the concept of like your ancestors learn things and it's been passed on to the next generation. But do you believe that self is not completely independent of ancestors, or is it more of a kind of a timeline that exists as opposed to being separate? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think that when we look at self, there are different ways to really kind of dig down deep to what that means to each person. And I think for me, I would say that myself is also included to my ancestors. And this kind of goes into a teaching of how our clan systems are passed down from generation to generation, from mother to grandchild. And grandmothers who had that same plan passed down. And so self can really, it can really mean a lot to different people and how they interpret it. But it takes a lot of self-exploration, right? And so kind of looking at those pillars of who were my ancestors, what is my familial history, looking at how do I conduct myself as a leader. Some of those things can go into self. I hope that helps answer.
Yeah, thanks.
On that same thought, you know, as you start to progress through the phases of life, that was very beautiful, by the way. And I loved the Venn diagrams and the circles. You know, it feels like as you progress into adulthood and elderly, you transition from yourself being more identified with your ancestors to maybe yourself being more identified, or you're passing on self to the next generation. Is that, you know, I guess, again, I'm like Alex having a hard time describing it, but I feel like your perception of self in relationship to ancestors and future generations changes over time. Is that true?
I would say so. Yeah. So kind of looking at that diagram of how our worldview is shaped and what we pass down. So those norms, values, and ethics.
Mm-hmm.
But ourself, I think we're constantly changing, and it's because we're constantly learning. And then to your other question, you know, a part of our belief in like elderly or our elders is that they go through an entire life of changing and really honing in on different parts of their self. And I kind of like to describe it like, for myself, when I was maybe in middle school, there was a part of me that wanted to be different, but then also wanted to be in with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And as we get older, right, we become okay with where we're at, what we offer, and some of those things we start to learn a little bit more. And, you know, when I went into like my family genogram, it really showed a lot of like how my behaviors kind of transpire over. And then some of the things that maybe my holistic health needed, such as maybe weaving, that was something that I needed for my heart to be able to engage and learn about the songs and bring myself to a present moment. So I think self definitely changes. And I think that we're all working to get to a point where we're able to pass down knowledge.
Pass it on. Yeah, exactly.
And so in that same way, I always like to say, like, what kind of ancestors will we be?
Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And if we acted like that every day, right? What would that do for the world? What would that do for future generations?
It would be better. Thank you.
So we do have a question in the chat. Is there something, a daily practice or an awareness someone can take away from this to continue on the road, the red road of holistic health?
I think that one of the biggest things that has helped me is really looking at what is my purpose? What do I really, really feel passionate about changing? And I think that is what really helps you from a day-to-day basis. And so for me, when I first wake up, it's kind of like, what is something I want to work on today to be healthy tomorrow? And so that might even be being kind to myself, because that implements a whole bunch of other things, right? And what I'm able to be capable, and it might be something small in that sense. I hope that answers the question.
I'll just unmute myself. Hi, Kaya. I was wondering what you think as an instructor has been the most successful way of practicing holistic health in the classroom, and how other TCUs could, adopt that practice.
I think for me, when I teach classes, I usually do a check-in with the students. And sometimes what we're covering might be very topic heavy. And students really taking into account, if it's spring quarter and they've only had 1 week off for break, and then going into the next quarter, how do I implement some sort of self-care for them? And sometimes it might be that I ask them for an assignment, do something self-care related to this topic. So if it's plants, go walk outside and go look at plants, use some of the knowledge that you've learned about maybe leaf characteristics, or learning about different parts of the cultural name for that plant, and then go look at it and just witness and observe. But I think inside the classroom for myself, I do my best to really implement, like on some days when I feel a little bit, low energy, then I also think about my students in the same way, that they're also human. A lot of our students have families, they have jobs, they have a lot of things on their plate, and just giving them that space to be human. So that's kind of one way that I try to bring in the holistic health and wellness to my classroom.